Greetings, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our weekend celebration of the life and work of Ann and Sasha Shulgin. My name is Peter Maravellis, and I'm the events director at City Lights. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, I'd like to welcome you to session 4 of our celebration. It is titled Psychedelic, Psychotherapy, and Social Impact. This event is being presented by City Lights in conjunction with Transform Press and Synergetic Press, as we inaugurate the release of their new book titled The Nature of Drugs, History, Pharmacology, and Social Impact, Volume 1. This is the first in a 2-volume set of writings based upon the lectures of the late Alexander Sasha Shulgin, recorded at San Francisco State University in the late 80s. Intended to be taught as an introductory course on drugs and biochemistry, the transcription is a unique document, being both an historical record of Alexander Shulgin's teaching style and the culmination of his philosophy on drugs, pharmacology, states of consciousness, and societal and individual freedoms related to the use of psychoactive substances. As we begin this session, I would like to acknowledge that this event is being broadcast from the site of the ancestral homelands of the Mwakma Ohlone peoples. On this peninsula, 8 different dialects of their language were once spoken. It is with respect to those who came before us that I would like to begin our proceedings and offer a moment of silence to stand in recognition of the place that we occupy. A special thanks goes out to our co-sponsors of this weekend's sessions. They are organizations that are at the forefront of pharmacological advocacy and research. A spirited thanks goes to the Beckley Foundation, the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, the Arrowwood Center, the Fireside Project, Lucid News, the McKenna Academy, also our friends at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also the Psychedelic Sangha, Psychedelic Society of San Francisco, and also the Psychedelic Society of the UK, and also including Psychedelic Seminars, Psychedelics Today, the USONA Institute, and last but not least, the City Lights Foundation, which is continuing the legacy of our late founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. This program could not have been realized without the collective efforts of a great many people, and it would be very difficult to list all of them here, but first and foremost, a huge debt goes out to Transform Press and Synergetic Press. I'd like to pay our respects to Ann Shulgin and Wendy Tucker for carrying on the legacy of Sasha's work, and also for just doing an amazing job of holding together this repository of amazing data. This collaboration with Synergetic Press continues their commitment to the research conducted by Ann and Sasha, and the mentorship they both offered to many gifted researchers that continue this important work. A huge thank you also is due to Deborah Parrish Snyder, the co-owner and publisher of Synergetic Press. Synergetic Press is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and for over 30 years have been publishing unique and paradigm-shifting books on the environment, ethnobotany, psychedelics, and cultural anthropology, and much, much more. Their collaboration with Transform Press is a really excellent example of the rich and important projects they continue to pursue. City Lights is honored to be working with them once again, as we've collaborated on numerous events in the past that have included people like Ralph Metzner, who've done tributes to Albert Hoffman, and much, much more. So a special thanks goes out to Sandy Balin, to Doug Reel, and Jasmine Virda at Synergetic. And also really want to spotlight Amanda Mueller, who had the crucial role to play in the production of The Nature of Drugs. I mean, the book itself is such a gorgeous artifact, is so beautifully produced, and really most fitting, for the content that it represents. Before we begin, I would like to let you know we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Nature of Drugs. Also, Kile Ortigo has a new book coming out. We'll also be posting links for that, and I'll be telling you more about that in the chat. We are also going to be selling copies of P-Call and T-Call, the 2 great formularies and kind of magnum opus of Ann and Sasha's work. Secondly, I'd also like to let you know that there's a real treat in store in between the sessions. There is a virtual environment that's based upon a hill located on the property next to the Shulgin's laboratory. There is a wonderful oak tree there that Sasha and Ann used to sit under. And nearby, there is this kind of doorway suspended in space. Once you enter it, you can visit the Shulgin laboratory. So I encourage you, please check out the link that we're going to be posting in the chat function. You do need Google Chrome to access it, but once you've got the link, you can pop in very easily. We want to thank our friends at Ozo for creating this, and really ever grateful to them. And finally, you can post questions and comments for the speakers using the chat function on your Zoom dashboard. There's going to be a Q&A towards the end, so please feel free to post. Our moderator for this session will be Dr. Jaz Phelps. Dr. Phelps is a full professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. She's served as the former dean of faculty at CIIS for the graduate departments in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. A licensed clinical psychologist, she has held faculty positions in the East-West Psychology graduate program, founded by Ellen Watts, and clinical psychology doctoral program. She is currently the founder and director of the CIIS Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, which conducts the first academically accredited and professional certificate training program for psychedelic-assisted therapy and research. Dr. Phelps maintains a private practice in Mill Valley. Joining the panel will be Dr. David Presti. Dr. Presti is a neurobiologist, psychologist, and cognitive scientist at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1991. Between 1990 and 2000, he worked as a clinical psychologist in the treatment of addiction and of post-traumatic stress disorder at the Department of Veteran Affairs Medical Center in San Francisco. Since 2004, he has been teaching neuroscience to Tibetan monks and nuns in India, Bhutan, and Nepal, part of a contemporary dialogue between science and spirituality initiated by the Dalai Lama. His areas of expertise include human neurobiology and neurochemistry, the effects of drugs on the brain and mind, the clinical treatment of addiction, and the scientific study of mind and consciousness. Our panel will also be joined by Dr. Kile Ortigo. Dr. Ortego is a clinical psychologist and founder of the Center for Existentialist Exploration, which supports people exploring profound questions about identity, meaning, life transitions, and psychospiritual development. He also serves on the advisory boards of Psychedelic Support, an online training and clinician directory for legal psychedelic-informed care, and also Project New Day, a nonprofit organization providing harm reduction resources for people using psychedelics in their addiction recovery process. He is the author of the recently released book, Beyond the Narrow Life, a guide for psychedelic integration and existential exploration, published, of course, by our friends at Synergetic Press, who also published The Nature of Drugs. And the two books have come out at the same time, so we're featuring this title alongside this event. We'll be posting links in our chat function with which you can purchase copies of the books. Dr. Ortigo was kind enough to drop by City Lights last week and sign the box worth of books, so please check it out. It's a wonderful tome. Also joining us for this session is Dr. William Richards. Dr. Richards is a psychologist in the psychiatric department at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Bayview Medical Center, a consultant trainer at sites of psychedelic research internationally, a teacher in the program of psychedelic therapy and research at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and also a clinician in private practice in Baltimore. In 1999 at Johns Hopkins, he and Roland Griffiths launched the rebirth of psilocybin research after a 22-year period of dormancy in the United States. His publications began in 1966 with Implications of LSD and Experimental Mysticism, co-authored with Walter Pahnke. His book, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, was published by Columbia University Press in 2015 and has since been translated into 4 languages. And to round off the panel, we are joined by Annie Oak. Ms. Oak is a journalist based in San Francisco. She has covered business, science, and politics for numerous news organizations, including Wired News, Fast Company, Agence France Presse, and several national public radio member stations. She has written extensively about gray market economies, including cannabis producers, and has investigated police actions and federal court cases involving the war on drugs. In 2020, Ms. Oak began serving as an editor and reporter for Lucid News, covering emerging businesses and research in the psychedelic industry. She founded the Women's Visionary Congress and co-founded its parent organization, the Women's Visionary Council, the first nonprofit for psychedelic women. She also created the Full Circle Tea House to provide a quiet space for psychonauts at music festivals. And is also the co-founder of Take 3 Presents, a San Francisco-based event production company that produces immersive art experiences. She is a longtime resident of the San Francisco Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. So please welcome now Dr. Jaz Phelps to moderate this session. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter. Well done. And thank you for the organization that you and Synergetic Press have done for this incredible weekend we've been having together. Thanks so much. So in order to start us out, I would like to do a full disclosure. I acknowledge that I live on unceded lands of the coastal Miwok in Marin County, California. I'd like to disclose my probable blind spots during this moderation due to my cultural intersectionality, which includes the fact that I'm a hetero, cis female, so I have the privilege of being a member of the heteronormative world. But conversely, I've been affected by misogynist attitudes in this patriarchal culture. My middle class and white privilege accelerated the opportunities to which I availed myself in order to earn a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. I acknowledge my gratitude to my BIPOC friends who have and are helping me learn to be a better ally. I am deeply grateful to my Peruvian and Indigenous and Mestizo teachers, Ronnie Renfillo-Yan and Jose Campos, for teaching me in traditional ceremonial ways of the lineage of Don Salome, as well as unnameable sage teachers in the lineages of Leo Zeff and Stan Groff, as well as Ralph Metzner himself. Several of these friends and teachers hold me accountable for my integrity. I ask the same of you. And without much ado, I will turn this over to Dr. David Presti. We're privileged to have David on our panel. David is an esteemed member of this whole space. Dr. Presti, all yours.
Thank you, Janis, and thanks everyone for being here. It truly is an honor to be part of this event, this amazing event highlighting the stunning accomplishments of Ann and Sasha Shulgin. I'll start out as well with an acknowledgement to, I live in Berkeley, I work in Berkeley. Berkeley is on, and the university, the community which grew up around it reside on the unceded ancestral lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. And it's really, I also honor this moment in history where there's so much increased awareness to acknowledging these deaths. And one of the messages evoked by the psychedelics is appreciation of connection, connection to one's ancestry and heritage, connection to community, connection to one's psyche, the collective psyche, to the biosphere and all the creatures therein. And one of our most ardent hopes, I believe, that all of us share is that from all of the increased attention and activity and public discourse to this subject now, that there will be creative actions that serve to enhance the greater good in whatever ways they might. So the nature of drugs, first of all, I just want to say again, as many folks have already said, this is a stunning book. It really, I had seen an early draft of the manuscript, and it has come a long way. I mean, just amazing editing, gorgeous art, beautiful production, printing, binding. It really is a spectacular addition to the Shulgin legacy. So thank you to Transform Press, to Wendy and Ann, and to Synergetic for bringing this to this incarnation. And thank you to City Lights for not only supporting this event, but for having for so many decades been a nexus of cultural activity in the San Francisco area. What a gift, and that you've been able to maintain that in this era of everything going online is all the more beautiful. So this weekend and this panel, I mean, why am I here? Over the 35 years or so that I've been active and thinking about and teaching on this subject of psychedelics, and my primary role has been that of a university educator. And in the 3 decades that I've been teaching in the university setting, I really consider it an enormous privilege to have taught more than 20,000 college undergraduates, hundreds of graduate students and medical students, and many already established professionals about psychedelics, and always been able to present them as part of a larger landscape of sacred medicinal plants, fungi, molecules, and within the context of rigorous biophysical science and psychological science, along with all of the historic, sociocultural, and legal complexities that go along with that. And really, I owe that style of being able to integrate and teach in the way that I've been blessed to be able to do totally to the Shulgins, and even very specifically to this book. So let me say a little bit about that story, because after a educational arc that included the study of all kinds of subjects, beginning with chemistry and physics, and leading then into biology and neuroscience and psychology, my interest has really been to deepen the scientific understanding of mind and reality and how they fit together. And in 1988, I moved from Eugene, Oregon to San Francisco to do a year-long clinical internship at the San Francisco VA. And at some point during the first few months there, I developed a friendship of someone, Howard Kornfeld, who was a mutual friend of the Shulgins, and he introduced me to Ann and Sasha, and to what then were, I believe, the Wednesday night dinners, and then, by the grace of God, here I was. I found myself in the sanctum sanctorum of psychedelic chemistry and its application to psychotherapeutic praxis, and I mean, needless to say, I was stunned, awed, and really just enormously grateful for that having happened. So I finished my internship. I went back to Oregon to finish my dissertation work in clinical psychology, and I had previously taught at the University of Oregon a course in biological psychology and introduction to psychology. And I was offered this chance to teach this course called Drugs and Behavior, which was in the catalog there and was usually taught by someone who was going to be on sabbatical that year. And so I took them up on the offer. I was really interested in the interaction of molecules and brain physiology and how that might be relevant to deepening an understanding of the nature of mind. I thought psychedelics were very interesting in particular. And so I wrote to Sasha and I said, we met a few months ago. Maybe you remember me, and I've been asked to teach this class on drugs, and I know that you and I talked about your teaching of that subject. Do you have any advice or counsel? And a few days later, I get this package in the mail, and in the package of the mail is this. And this is basically, these are the transcripts of the lectures that went into this book, The Nature of Drugs. So Sasha had taught this course at the San Francisco State University a couple of years previously. He had all these transcripts that he and Ann had put together, and he just shared them with me, just gave them to me. And it just speaks amazingly to his generosity as a teacher, as an educator, around the ease with which he shared everything that he knew, anything and everything that he knew, with great generosity and comfort. And this kind of attitude all permeated everything he did. Of course, in his amazingly creative chemistry, he was always wanting to publish in peer-reviewed journals the syntheses of the molecules that he discovered or invented, their properties, to put as much information out there as possible. And then he and Ann then went the further step to write these magnificent books, Kile and Kile, where they not only made sure that all the syntheses and summaries of the properties were gathered together in one easily accessible place, they also filled it full of gorgeous narrative around romance and art and science and politics and law, and such really important contributions to the history of this subject that are so important to pass on as we are involved in the education of new generations of folks that that are interested in expanding this field. And that has really informed everything that I've done, and the way that I teach about this subject is the model of Ann and Sasha and really educating and connecting community via both heart and mind kind of modalities. So let me say briefly about Sasha's contributions as a chemist, because that certainly was one of the things that inspired me, was listening to him talk about molecules. And although this has been said in various ways already, I mean, his contributions truly were legion, in the sense that at the time that Ann and Sasha, who both had their experiences with mescaline around the same time, completely independently, and Sasha through the molecule and Ann through the peyote cactus, there were very few psychedelics known in their chemical forms. I mean, there was LSD, there was lysergic acid amide, psilocybin, psilocin, mescaline, of course, and DMT. And that's pretty much it in 1960. And then, I mean, not even THC had been identified as the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. And then Sasha got involved in the chemistry. And now there are easily over 100 molecules known that are established as psychedelic-like. Some would say 200. Most of those have been directly or indirectly invented by Sasha Shulgin. And so it's an amazing kind of heroic body of work, which in many ways might never be possible again, because so much territory of molecular structure has been completely explored and cultivated by that work. And of course, the properties of these molecules, the powers that they might have to explore the mind-brain connection, the therapeutic utilities, that some of which have been investigated, most of which have not been in any kind of formal way. They're all, much work to keep folks busy well into the future. And I think it's also interesting to note that if we look at the long arc of the history of science, most discoveries that are made, things that are just considered big scientific discoveries, they kind of come around at a time when they were ripe to happen. And then some individual or small number of individuals kind of makes the leap to put things together. But if those folks wouldn't have done it, other people would have done it. And you can look at many discoveries in the history of science that way, the kind of elemental nature of chemistry, the processes of biological evolution by variation and selection, electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic radiation, special relativity, quantum physics, nuclear fission, the development of the first atomic weapons, the structure of DNA and the genetic code. All of those things are considered, huge scientific discoveries. But if whoever did those things hadn't lived, somebody else would have also done those around the same time. That's not necessarily true for everything, though. Like, for example, Einstein's theory of general relativity might not have been invented by anyone else. The whole idea that you could describe the whole space-time cosmos as some kind of weird warped geometry was so out of the box that it's not clear anyone else would have come up with that. Or if Hoffman hadn't messed around making different derivatives of ergotamine, it's quite possible that no one else would have stumbled on this uniquely interesting molecule of LSD. And I think the same argument can be made around the Sasha Shulgin compounds, that if someone else hadn't had the kind of innovative wit to move methoxy groups around the molecule and add this there and take this off there and so forth, and then test them on themselves in the way that Ann and Sasha did, and really deeply take a look at what is going on in the heart and in the mind when these chemicals are ingested. No one else may have done that work in that way that would have led to the kinds of discoveries that we now have before us. So in that sense, the Shulgin's work was truly alchemical, in that it really was this deep intersection of the psyche and matter in a way that has largely been lost in contemporary science. Over the last few centuries, there really has been an effort, an originally concerted effort, to remove the psyche from nature and to really study nature as if it was some big machine, including our bodies, as if they were just mechanical machines that we can reduce to component parts and figure out how they work in that way. And that perspective certainly has utility, but it also has amazing, limitations to it. And the Shulgin's work with the invention of these molecules and then the testing of these molecules in themselves to really determine their properties was this really deep intersection of mind and matter.
Hi, Sandy, it's Janis. Sorry to bother you. I don't have Peter's phone number to use. I turned my video off.
Hey, Janis.
Oh.
So again, they gave the Shulgins gave alchemy a good name, which is a great thing to have, because I think part of the task of the modern world and the modern scientific enterprise is to more deeply appreciate again the intersection of mind and world in a way that has been decoupled for a few centuries now. And this will have transformative effects on everything that we do, really, beginning with biomedical science, because this is true mind-body medicine. It's at its very deepest level. So I'll wrap it up with that for the time being and look forward to continuing this discussion in the minutes ahead.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate all those insights. And we'll come back to you when we have a discussion together with all the panelists. And I apologize to you. I didn't realize I wasn't unmuted. So here, everybody, I just made the first tech mistake. So now it's been done. You can relax, oh dear panelists. So I will call upon Dr. Bill Richards, dear friend and incredible legacy teacher and mentor and trailblazer for the rest of us. Bill, all yours.
Well, hello, everyone. It's an honor to participate in this incredible event, especially to honor Sasha and Ann, and all my colleagues here who are, it's exciting. Kile's book has just come out. I understand my copy is going to arrive tomorrow. I can hardly wait to see it. David's book is classic. I hope you'll discover mine if you haven't. We all have a lot to say from very different perspectives. Also Annie's book. I've been asked to give a few introductory comments on positionality, which I am happy to do. And this is a word that has just arrived on the East Coast, but we're honoring it and trying to be more cognizant of our blind spots. I confess I am an 81-year-old white heterosexual dude. I have had the privilege to do fascinating work with psychedelics through most of my life, beginning when I was 23 years old at the University of Göttingen, a decade at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center from 67 to 77, and now 21 years at Johns Hopkins, now in our Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Who'd have thunk? So it's a very hopeful time in the psychedelic world. During those many years, I've had the really great privilege, and that's no exaggeration, of working with an incredible variety of mainly suffering human beings, some so-called normal, healthy people who don't suffer quite as dramatically, but we suffer too. I've worked with people suffering from depression, alcohol and narcotic addictions, existential distress associated with advancing cancer, and also leaders in both the mental health and religious professions. I've learned a lot from everyone. I honor each person I've worked with. In terms of disclosure, I kind of want to tell you that I live on a very beautiful wooded piece of land in Baltimore, Maryland, that was once cared for by Indians, most likely the Lumbee tribe. I actually did find an arrowhead in my backyard once, which I treasure as a real link to the heritage that surrounds me. I have a very rich extended family, relatives from Chinese, Iranian, and African-American heritages. I just want to go on record saying that I am very committed to empowering new researchers from diverse backgrounds and sexual orientations, especially seeking to improve the balance of women, African-American, and Oriental practitioners in the psychedelic research community. This is a gradual process that takes some time, but we are consciously committed to it. Now, the assigned topic is social impact. And when I thought of that, I thought first of something very general and then something very specific. So I'll present both to you in the limited time we have together in this initial presentation. First, as most of you know, there is no such thing as kind of the psychedelic experience, but there are incredible, vast experiential worlds within all of us, beyond the limits of our egos, our usual sense of self, that part of ourselves that goes with our proper name, that we now know that the human being is really an incredible mystery of rich, rich reservoirs of knowledge and experience. And among these many different states of consciousness, there is what we call mystical consciousness. And it's fascinating that at this point in time, mystical consciousness is really becoming a scientific term. And it's not something that's misty or vague or has anything to do with fortune tellers and turbans, but it's a very discrete state of consciousness that people often report in psychedelic research. And we define it in the research world in 6 categories: a sense of unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, a feeling of sacredness or awesomeness, deeply felt positive mood, joy, peace, love, pristineness, playfulness, and what we call ineffability and paradoxicality, that it's so beyond the usual limits of language and cognition that we know what the Tao Te Ching intends to say when it says, those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know, okay? But we know that when this state of consciousness occurs and is reported by a volunteer in our research studies, that is when we often see the most dramatic improvements in mental and, if you will, spiritual health. It seems to be incredibly powerful and meaningful. Of course, it needs to be integrated, and that's, Kile will talk some of that, I think. You know, it's not just having the experience. It's not a guarantee of sainthood, but it's an awakening to what the spiritual life or the process of self-actualization. Choose your words. Now, as people have these experiences, their concept of who they are changes. An addict who experienced mystical consciousness can no longer honestly view himself as helpless or worthless or not connected to mankind. In that unitive experience, there's an intuitive conviction that you belong, that you're part of a greater network of reality. And these states have a feeling of reality that feels, if you will, more fundamental, more real than our everyday consciousness. One could argue it's a big delusion, but it's mighty convincing when you're in it. And people who experience this depth of knowledge generally are quite content within themselves. They don't need to impose it on other people, but they trust their intuitive knowledge. That's why I called my book Sacred Knowledge. It's to highlight this intuitive knowledge that goes with these states of mind. William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, called it the noetic quality of these states. But it's a non-rational but not irrational discovery of what feels very fundamental and truth. And of course, one of those insights is our interconnectedness. The family of, we used to call it the family of man. Now we better call it the family of humankind. But that not only all humanity, but perhaps even all life forms, all atoms of the universe are somehow meaningfully interconnected. And of course, as that attitude gets trusted and communicated, there is a social impact. There's a valuing of diversity, not just a tolerating of it, but a fascination with different ways of being in the world. And this kind of intuitive knowledge that we really are brothers and sisters, if you will. A footnote here, psychedelics have been around a long time, at least from 5500 BC. And they emerge in cultures and they get suppressed, and they emerge and they get suppressed, very much like mushrooms. They appear and disappear. And now here they are emerging in the early 21st century. And our hope is that we have finally evolved enough. We can have sufficient good judgment and patience and verbal skills to integrate them wisely into our culture. I mean, we all know, there's no question, more is involved than just throwing a mushroom or a drug of one kind into one's mouth and see what happens. One needs to be prepared. One needs to know something of how to navigate in the inner world. One needs to be interpersonally grounded. One needs to be willing to go through some suffering in the interest of personal growth and not just call it a bad trip, okay? There's a lot to learn. In my book, I use the metaphor of downhill skiing. You know, if you just jump on a pair of skis and start downhill without any instruction, as I did once when I was young, that's pretty stupid, okay? But no, if you want to ski, you get instruction about the art of skiing. And the same is true of using psychedelics. And that knowledge is now available. And anyone interested in pursuing it, please get well educated before you consider it, whether it's legal or illegal. Okay. One of the most profound insights in mystical forms of consciousness is often expressed as love, that the ultimate energy in the core of the psyche is this stuff we call love. Now that sounds so poetic, and it's tempting to discount it. I think of how Dante in the end of the Divine Comedy says, it is love that moves the sun and other stars. But insofar as we are attuned to that energy, that love manifests itself in the world. It makes us more compassionate towards ourselves and towards others. And it makes, like Teilhard de Chardin's idea that we are gradually evolving in consciousness towards a more peaceful, beautiful world. Maybe that's not total fantasy, but there's some real substance to that. Okay, so much for general comments. I could say much more about that, but I want to spend a few minutes zeroing in on one application of psychedelics. I like to talk about the medical applications, the educational applications, and the religious applications. But one medical application that I am especially dedicated to right now is the work in palliative care. And using psilocybin specifically in promoting the mental health of people with serious illnesses, often terminal cancer. I have the privilege right now of working at the Aquilino Cancer Center in Rockville, Maryland, actually just about a mile from FDA headquarters. That's kind of symbolic. But where we are giving psilocybin to cancer patients, they're experimenting with a group format, kind of a hybrid of individual and group therapy in an attempt to make the intervention, while safe and effective, also more economically feasible, in the hopes that Medicare might cover it, as well as other insurance companies in the near future. And then sunstone-therapies.com has come into being to pave the way to help other centers, especially oncology centers, to implement this form of therapy. And of course, with Janis, we're hard at work trying to figure out how to train enough psychedelic therapists to meet the need in the near future. So we're kind of on the cusp of a very promising frontier. Now, why is the psilocybin experience helpful to cancer patients? Well, especially if they have a transcendental, mystical type of experience. But even if they don't, there is more self-knowledge. There's resolution of trauma and interpersonal conflicts and fear. But we find that many of our volunteers, perhaps most of them, after a single well-implemented psilocybin experience, claim decreases in depression and anxiety, more interpersonal openness and enjoyment of interacting with family and friends instead of withdrawing to the bedroom waiting for the next dose of narcotic, not wanting anyone to see me like this, you know?
Bill, pardon me for this interruption. It's much more graceful than what I did with David. I'm getting my act together here. You got 5 more minutes.
Okay, that's all I need. Thank you.
Love what you're saying. Keep going.
Okay, there's less preoccupation with pain. Typically, people say the pain is still there, but it doesn't bother me like before. And in the center of consciousness is relationships. And one of the most intriguing facets of this research is that many people claim to have lost the fear of death. That death now is approached more with curiosity and openness than with dread. And that's not necessarily because they're convinced of personal immortality, though some may lean in that direction. But there's this just sense that the universe is in good hands, that consciousness is felt to be somehow indestructible, that there is a dimension of consciousness that is eternal, access not only perhaps after death and before birth, but as our Zen Buddhist friends would like to remind us, it's there to be found in the middle of the present moment as well, that there is an eternal dimension of consciousness that we can discover and cultivate, and we can live with one foot in the eternal world and one foot in the temporal world. And I think that's what we call beginning to be enlightened. And It's said to really be a good way to be in the world. It's interesting to me that people who claim to lose their fear of death do not become suicidal, that there's no rush. And there's an opening up, a living fully, a treasuring of each day that we are given. Now, if this form of therapy, this intervention, really becomes mainstream and is offered not only in research departments, but in busy oncology centers. And perhaps if we can provide psilocybin not only to the acutely ill person, but maybe to a close family member to help them with grieving, then all of a sudden, this is not a frontier so much as it's becoming part of the mainstream of life. And to me, that is an immense social impact. If we really start to change the way our culture approaches and views death, that would be huge.
Mm-hmm.
And I leave that with you for the moment.
Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate you centering love and the transitions that people go through with mystical experiences. We'll come back to that during our time when we're discussing things as a whole panel. What I'd like to do for the participants here who've been listening to us, we're halfway through the presentations. I would like to welcome you to put a couple words up into the chat for your peers to see about what inspired you about what David and Bill have shared. Put a couple words up. We have not been hearing from many people, some people, but not many who are here. Please go ahead and put a word or two up in the chat about how you're feeling and what you've learned so far. And we'll move to Dr. Kile Ortigo, who you've heard Peter introduce you to. And I'd like to acknowledge Kyle's new book that has come out, and Bill has done what I haven't read yet, but I'm sure it's an incredible foreword to this book for Kile. And I'm so proud to say that Kile is an esteemed graduate of the CIS training program for psychedelic assisted therapists. So Kile, all yours.
Okay, I was muted. Let's see if I can.
You get do-overs now.
I will be made presenter. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to actually do this in a PowerPoint presentation. And part of the reason why I do this is because it's an excuse to show a lot of beautiful art that speaks to me personally. So what I would like to start, though, is just to acknowledge, first off, that I'm talking to you all virtually from a place in the ancestral lands of the Ohlone indigenous people here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I also want to acknowledge the indigenous people who originally cared for the land where I was born and raised in rural Hot Springs, Arkansas, the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw people. Today, I'll be talking to you as a clinical psychologist, a writer, and a man of largely European American ancestry who also happens to be the first in my family to go to college, much less earn a doctorate. Still, I recognize that regardless of my personal experiences and training, I, like all of us, have my blind spots. I believe there's no better way to learn about and address our blind spots than with safe, respectful dialogue in our close, trusted relationships. And I've been blessed with many such relationships, and I'd like to acknowledge here a few people who identify as people of color, women, queer, and or who come from another background or belong to another generation than my own, as I admit, being a millennial. These people here have been some of my most trusted allies and early reviewers of my new book, Beyond the Narrow Life. When writing my book, I came across a letter written by Carl Jung to encourage a friend. He quoted an ancient alchemist's advice to one of their pupils. No matter how isolated you are and how lonely you feel, if you do your work truly and conscientiously, unknown friends will come and seek you. Especially during this last year of personal and collective challenges of 2020, I've learned to trust in that advice myself. Given my experiences with such diverse allies, friends, and colleagues, I believe fundamentally there's more that connects us than divides us. But to fully realize this interconnectedness, we must acknowledge the uneven distribution of both joys and sorrows across the near and distant past of our various communities. My closest direct lineage to the use of psychedelics in indigenous cultures is that of the Mazatec people and their sacred mushroom ceremonies. I'd like to voice a deep-seated appreciation, in particular to Maria Sabina, the curandera Mazatec woman who at great risk to herself allowed Westerners to partake in these rituals. Maria was eventually ostracized by her community because of the unwanted attention this garnered. Her home was burned down and her son was killed. If it weren't for her involuntary sacrifices, I can't say that any of us would be here now talking about psychedelic psychotherapy, at least involving psilocybin. This recognition of the social impact is a major theme of today's panel. It's in the spirit of profound respect and hope for a more mutually beneficial and interconnected world that I offer this talk with you all, both with the other panelists who I greatly admire and everyone joining us in this meaningful conversation. Last but not least, I like to acknowledge the artists who have been, actually this one is Gustav Atab, who did the cover art for my book. But I also want to acknowledge Peter Moorbacher, who has his series Angelium.net, if you're interested in his work. Gustav, who's a Brazilian artist, and this is some of his street art, and Lysander Alström Kramer, who did some of the interior graphics. So to situate my talk even further, there's this great academic paper. We don't always have great titles for academic papers, but one by Letcher is Mad Thoughts on Mushrooms. And if you're interested in just holding some of the tensions in the psychedelic space, which is incredibly diverse, I highly recommend it. Letcher describes what can and can't be said and by whom in any given context, at least by perception. What's likely impossible is talking across these different frames of reference and being truly objective. I'm not going to go over each of these, but I'm going to situate myself here in the psychological and psychedelic frames of reference. So the psychological is whether and how psychedelics can be used for medication or for treatment for mental health concerns. And the psychedelic is whether and how they can be used for self-exploration. So I'm already kind of breaking the rules by his paper by trying to talk about both, but that's my aim. I also want to acknowledge the different roles of science, theory, spiritual frameworks, and art, and respect all of those. Anytime I give a talk about psychedelics, this image comes to mind because Bill once gave me the piece of advice, wise piece of advice, to shoot a straight arrow when giving a talk. And this is what I think of in terms of all the things that could be said about psychedelics and all the various fractal qualities of them. But I'm going to try to do that and shoot a straight arrow while talking about my book. My book, I want to give you some behind the scenes about what really motivated me to write this in the first place. I recognize, like all of us, significant challenges in today's world, some of them new, some of them not, and some of these complex global problems, including the mental health crisis, the risk of ecological collapse, a crisis of meaning, and demoralization when people do have values and meaning, frustration, their inability to put those into practice. The political polarization, the myriad isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and all forms of othering, in-group versus out-group. We see this manifested in mental health symptoms, the pandemic of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and intergenerational trauma that affects all of us in some way. So I think we need some powerful, innovative solutions, and hopefully ones that recognize our interconnectedness alongside respecting complexity and ambiguity. These are not easy problems. And somehow inspire us all to heal, step up our game, and work together. So psychedelics come to mind as a powerful yet complicated tool. I describe them as experientially potent, multifaceted. There's just so many experiences people can have during them. And I do believe that integration work is where it's at in terms of having a real impact on people's lives. and hopefully to face personal problems, but also our collective ones. Ideally in a way that we can partner with others to heal our communities and our planet. But what I call translation problems exist, and they exist when moving from the profound, mystical-like psychedelic experiences to our everyday life and consensus reality, and then trying to effectively apply some of the insights that are gained. Have to mention too, the legal status, and even if things are decriminalized, legalized, rescheduled, there will be access to care issues because there are with traditional psychotherapy too. So given all this, my very small piece of the puzzle as an offering, as a psychologist and author, I wanted to create a resource that was available now at low cost to get something out there for people. Trying to thread the needle too. And what I mean by that is bridging the personal healing and collective renewal, locating a space where science, spirituality, and art are transformed into allies, and respect the spirit of the medicine, which often plays with paradox and mystery. And finally, promote some evolution of the hero figure, archetype, or idea to meet our modern challenges. So for those of you who are therapists or trained in psychedelic psychotherapy or read any of the books that have already been mentioned, you know that generally there are 3 phases of psychedelic therapy. Those are preparation, the psychedelic experience itself, and the integration process. Depending on the protocol and use, these are often repeated too. When I first learned about this, I thought immediately of Joseph Campbell's The Comparative Mythologist, his monomyth or the hero's journey, trying to look at an overarching framework that seems to synthesize a lot of the world's major religions, mythologies, and sources of meaning. Those phases are departure, initiation, where the hero can go through trials and hopefully win some rewards or boons or powers, and the return to protect one's community. Why I think it's helpful to make this bridge is because it is a way to connect the mental health treatment and healing options with the personal development world and personal growth. The hero's journey can be viewed from a purely psychological lens, or it can be viewed from a metaphysical one, but you don't have to go full metaphysical to receive some of the benefits, I think. And it bridges, again, the personal and collective concerns. The hero's journey also brings in the role of mentors, allies, communities, and foils. So that relational quality is emphasized too, and many different types of relationships. And myth is living, real myth is alive. It's updated with our times. It applies to our modern challenges in different ways, with warnings about how we can go off the tracks. And because myth is alive, it's situated in modern times. So I like to ask what our evolving myths are telling us. For any of you who are film fans like I am, this is a film that actually introduced me into film studies, which is one of my first loves, Projecting the Shadow, the cyborg myth in American film. And these were my film mentors, Janis Rushing and Thomas Frentz, who used the hero's journey in Carl Jung's work to describe film as our cultural dream. And it speaks to us in our collective unconscious what our personal dreams does to our personal consciousness and self. This has been very popular in film, Joseph Campbell's work, for a variety of reasons. If you know Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Lion King, Wonder Woman, I could go on and on and on. You know this general idea and framework. I'm not going to go through all the stages, but I'll mention that it usually starts with a call to adventure that the hero can say yes or no to. And the departure in Star Wars, this is when Luke leaves Tatooine, his desert homeworld, and goes into space. The initiation phase, which has many steps, but I'm highlighting here when he goes to Dagobah and meets Yoda, the wise elder who trains him. And an important part of this initiation phase is that the ego, the sense of individual self and fear, is what's usually put in check, fear and control. And then finally, the return. This is coming back to save the larger community. So this is my alchemical synthesis in my book, and I'm excited to actually show that I have a physical copy of it for the first time, which is mind-blowing to me. It's been quite a journey for myself, and just got this Thursday, so it's hot off the presses. But my goal when doing this was to provide a guided exploration of psychedelic-inspired themes, and I want it to be readable, not sound super academic, have conversational tone. I use I, you, we throughout. Allows personalization. I didn't want to just talk to people. I wanted there to be an encouraged sense of personal agency for the reader. And I keep the big questions front and center. I want it to be able to be used for psychedelic integration, but also be able to stand alone. And hopefully be a resource for therapists, coaches, and clients, and everyone else, if not used independently. Some of the features include the examples, illustrations. I have pop culture references. There are experiential and reflective activities throughout. And when synthesizing the psychedelic therapy in the hero's journey, I created this overall structure. So these are my 3 phases or 3 arcs. Expanding awareness as part of the preparation phase and departure phase. Confronting the trials of initiation. These are the medicine sessions. And then integrating the self and beyond, the integration phase. So I'm honored to have Bill write my foreword for the book, which Janis already mentioned. And he starts out in a way that really entices, or I dare say, dares the reader to go further. And then my prologue is the call to adventure. The first chapter, this is one of the graphics from Lysander in it, is one that acts as an informed consent about what we're going to do, and also has a self-care plan, how to take care of yourself as you do these deeper explorations. Each arc has an introduction, and to do this work, I thought of metaphorical allies that we could call forward, and they're either internal resources or attitudes or people that represent these qualities that can help encourage us when things are challenging or we don't know where to go. There's also an intention setting and revisiting exercise as part of this. So each of the 9 chapters I call waypoints along the journey, and there are 9 features that I want to highlight that's consistent across these. The first is the self-reflections check-in, the pause before going deeper. The core chapter content, which is an overview of relevant key concepts, simple arc-specific exercises. These are like brainstorm activities. In the second arc, there's a sentence completion task, which is one of the classic activities that we have in psychology, in my field. There's suggested applications of some of these abstract ideas to everyday life. There's an anonymous psychedelic journey report to tie the theme to what happens in some people's psychedelic journeys. There's a grounding words brief summary to again situate where we're at in the larger journey. And then I end with the assignment, your choice again. This is a curated menu of activities. And this is from the second waypoint, which is on expanding self-awareness. And as you see, I have a list of options that are quite different, from taking free personality tests, do daily journaling. There's a meditation I create for each chapter. And then this other one is picking archetypes and exploring them and their representations and pop culture, myth, religion, and your culture of origin or cultures of origin. And then finally, there's a travel journal prompt, which you can respond with words, prose, poetry, or symbolically with art, depending on your proclivities. So the first art was expanding awareness, and thinking about the metaphorical ally for this one was pretty easy to me. It was curiosity. Curiosity helps lead us down various paths to expand our sense of awareness. And what makes us curious is dependent on our individual experiences and personalities, what we're exposed to. So it's a good ally. I wanted to start with cosmic awareness because I didn't really hear this spoken about at all in my clinical psychology training. And I think it's so important to situate all of us in where we are in time and space from a basic science point of view. So this is from the series The Cosmos. This is the cosmic calendar. And this is the 13.8 billion years of the known universe in existence put into one calendar year. January 1st to December 31st. And this bottom line here is the last 60 seconds of that. And our written records are only here. So whenever I'm feeling pretty confident, I like to remind myself that, yep, I'm pretty new and small here. And that instills a sense of awe in me personally. Similarly, though, I think we can look at this self-awareness in ways of incorporating the personal unconscious and even collective unconscious. So this is one symbol I have in that chapter. Experiential awareness, expanding that was expanding mindfulness and awareness of what I'm calling the 4 modes of experiencing. These are thought, emotion, body, and behavior. And doing all of this prepares us, and in those last four too, I have skills for building awareness and for coping in each of those. And that is a nice segue into doing the deeper work of what I'm calling the triads of initiation. The model for how to do this work had to be more sophisticated than curiosity here. And so acceptance was the metaphorical ally that came to mind. Another feature of this arc is really thinking about the warnings, what I call the off-ramps of the hero's journey. For those of you who know the idea of spiritual bypass, this is sometimes addressing that and the risk for that. And I'm happy to talk about that in discussion if that's of interest to folks. So I start with mortality and impermanence, solitude and interconnectedness. We've heard about that a little bit already today. And this is one symbol for the various levels of interconnectedness that I want to highlight and reflect on. Meaninglessness and finding one's personal sense of meaning and responsibility to enact that. And then that allows us to go into the third and final arc, integrating insights into the self and beyond. And this ally had to be our most sophisticated and multifaceted, and that was wisdom for me. I start with going beyond personal identity, moving beyond shadow projection, and shadow is the parts of ourselves that we're unaware of or don't like to think about and of other people, and a way to navigate the complexities of the shadow through compassion, both self-compassion and compassion for others. And then finally, the namesake of the book, Beyond the Narrow Life, and exploring creativity and a renewed sense of heroism. And this is a symbol, not for you to actually read all the words. This is in the book, but this is an expansion of all of the book's concepts, or most of them. And then I end with an epilogue of continuing the journey and seeing how the journey never ends and the nonlinear aspects of living our lives. I hope and think that the potential uses of the book come in many different ways. One, as a therapist, I think of it as a therapeutic tool, potentially for people who are wanting to do deeper work in their therapy and wrestle with the bigger questions. So going beyond simply symptom reduction or healing in a short-term model. Spark a creative drive in both the therapists and clients. But I think the most common use of this will actually be in some sort of peer support or peer-to-peer groups. And this is so necessary because we don't have enough therapists and people to help others, and especially the long, ongoing, nuanced integration process. Someone described this as Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, a workbook about reconnecting with one's creativity, meets Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, which is capturing what I was kind of trying to do. And I think when doing this work with others, it is a way to deepen your personal relationships. It could work because retreat models are very popular now for a variety of reasons. I think it could work for the preparation or integration resource for people, because often those are very limited in the retreat model. And then what I call all the spaces in between, from the casual use to psycho-spiritual development. And then casting a big net, which is a value of mine. So a lot of people who are cautiously curious as psychedelics are entering mainstream consciousness again, to these intrepid psychonauts, that there's something for everyone. And with that, I'm going to end with a piece of sage advice, actually, that I read from Houston Smith, who is a comparative religion scholar. And this was based on an interview. He was asked if he had advice for the current generation of seekers who are using psychedelics to explore. And he had lots of words of caution, but ultimately he summed up his perspective as such: be cautious, go slow, but do not give up the quest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Love that last quote that you invoke from Campbell. And your artwork is phenomenal. Can't wait to be able to crack the cover. More questions for you on your book and the ideas in it later. Thank you very much. Congratulations for an epic journey you made, heroically bringing back insights and putting that into the book.
Thank you.
So we'll turn now to Annie Harrison, who will take over, and we'll enjoy what Annie has to share with us. Thanks, Annie.
You're welcome. Thank you, Janis. I'm delighted to be here with you all today, and I've greatly enjoyed the presentations that we've been listening to, and also the comments in the chat. That's been a lot of fun as well. I'd like to offer some thoughts today about the need for psychedelic assisted therapies, the scaling of training programs for therapists, and access to these services for underserved communities. First, I think it's important to recognize the legacy of what Ann and Sasha Shulgin have taught us all about service and caring for individuals and communities as people use psychedelic compounds and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for healing and exploring consciousness. As we watch this expansion of for-profit and nonprofit models for delivering psychedelic assisted therapies, I've been reflecting a lot on the courage of people like Ann and Sasha. You know, we all stand on the shoulders of Indigenous healers, researchers, activists, and explorers of consciousness who for years risked social shaming, arrest, and in some cases, legal prosecution. Some of them live here in my neighborhood in Haight-Ashbury. Outside my window is my neighborhood, and some of them still do. I think it's important to remember that in many places, these same challenges still exist for people who want to exercise their basic First Amendment rights to talk and write about psychedelics and other drugs, and to gather in places where psychedelics are used, especially if they're not academics or researchers or licensed therapists. And this remains especially true for members of BIPOC communities who have always been at greater risk for being targeted during the war on drugs and are still at greater risk of harassment and arrest. Drug possession remains the most arrested offense in the US, and I think it's important to remember that. I think in this context, it's also very important to support those writing and speaking about psychedelics and acknowledge the leadership of City Lights as an organization that has for years defended the rights of writers and artists who have always been on the forefront of psychedelics, and Transform Press and Synergia Press, who have published The Nature of Drugs and many other beautiful books on these topics. I have a lot of gratitude to Sasha and Ann for their contributions, not just as a chemist and a therapist, but also as writers, for cleverly publishing PCAL and TCAL as fiction as a way to help protect their community, and for understanding, really understanding, that it was essential for them to undergo the arduous work of writing all 6 of their books to help make sure that the knowledge that they collected as a chemist and a therapist and as intrepid explorers of consciousness were not lost and were preserved for future generations. I'm also very grateful to them for modeling a relationship based on respect for Ann's enormous contributions to the field of psychedelic psychotherapy, in particular, the examination of the shadow as an essential element in personal evolution and growth with psychedelic substances and with other forms of psychotherapy. I also want to give a shout out to Fire and Earth Arrowwood for also modeling equitable partnership that I think we should pay close attention to. And it's important to give equal weight to the contributions of not only Ann Shulgin, but the many women who have worked in psychedelic research and the development of psychedelic assisted therapies, especially the many women providing psychedelic assisted therapies in the underground, or what we now call unregulated markets, and to acknowledge people of all genders who are doing this work, often at some risk to themselves. I also want to acknowledge Ann and Sasha's contribution to safety and education, about psychedelics. You know, for years, Ann and Sasha agreed to join us at our Women's Visionary Congress and very generously hold open-ended conversations with us that we called Ask the Shulgins. They essentially served as our psychedelic grandparents and mentors, and we got to ask them any questions we wanted, not just about psychedelics, but about our own personal development, other substances, many topics. I was always struck by Sasha's ability to clearly explain his research to non-scientists and to speak honestly about the risks of certain substances. And there has also been a lot of good work on education, carrying on this tradition done by Arrowwood and Dance Safe and other groups. I also always loved the fact that Ann and Sasha never judged people for the substances they chose to ingest. They equally valued substances synthesized in laboratories and those ingested as plant material, which I think is an important lesson to remember. And they treated everyone with respect, regardless of whether they had an advanced degree or a university education or their background. I really treasure that perspective that they brought to our community and that we should all carry on and I think remember. As an event producer, I also learned important lessons from the Shulgins about the importance of caring for one's community, the value of discretion, which they always upheld during their Friday night dinners, remembering that there could be undercover authorities at a dinner or a party and to always be prepared for that and be prepared to defend one's rights to gather and speak, and also understand that relatively few people will have access to knowledgeable therapists who understand psychedelic substances. You know, Ann and Sasha understood that some people will choose to use these substances on their own to attempt to address their PTSD or depression or anxiety. And that while using these substances, people may encounter their shadow selves that Ann has spoken so eloquently about, and that these shadow selves might present themselves in a community setting, at an event or a party that you are organizing. And so I think one of the things that we learned from the Shulgins is not to turn away from this, but instead courageously accept this as part of the human journey of self-discovery, and to create systems to care for people who choose to take psychedelics in a non-clinical environment, which is the environment the vast majority of people who use these substances find themselves in. And as MAPS has become increasingly effective, and other research groups as well, in making the world understand the potential for the effectiveness of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD, or other therapeutic approaches and treatments using psychedelic substances, you know, those of us who produce events could see that a growing number of people who are learning about these substances, but have perhaps a limited background or knowledge, will have access to trained psychotherapists. And so it's important to remember that these kinds of community support services are really essential. You know, sometimes we note that it's interesting that that sometimes, you know, in the past, the party culture has made the circumstances more challenging for researchers. Now, researchers, by drawing so much attention to the healing potential of psychedelics, are sometimes creating more challenging situations for people in party cultures or event producers who want to offer education and safety services and risk reduction as well. So the Shulgins, you know, always encouraged us to take action to protect our community and get serious about risk reduction. The Arrowwoods helped the Women's Visionary Council develop risk reduction workshops years ago that helped us present the most important drug skills for people, how to properly weigh and measure substances to prevent overdose, how to test substances to make sure they're not adulterated, and how to use naloxone or Narcan to reverse potentially fatal overdoses, which has become an even more urgent issue with the escalation of overdoses linked to fentanyl and other opioids. So we also have included, of course, lots of knowledge about proper set and setting, the creation of quiet spaces for people who need support during psychedelic experiences. And I would like to personally thank all the people who have received training in psychedelic psychotherapy or other mental health skills and therapies who are offering those skills to provide peer support with ranger teams or T-servers or members of the Zendo project, people who serve at events where people may be using these substances and offering their knowledge and their training back to the community outside of clinical settings. And this is really important. It's an essentially important community that supports the health and well-being of people using psychedelics in many settings. So I want to take a step back and think about the importance of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to all sorts of important communities. And this is really an essential thing. We published a story on June 13th by Justin Hampton about clinics seeking to widen access to psychedelic therapy for BIPOC and other marginalized communities. Lucid News is publishing a lot of these kinds of stories about psychedelic assisted therapies, and I think this was a particularly good one. Justin quoted Darren Young, a therapist, president and CEO of Black Therapists Rock, and Darren talked about how psychedelic assisted therapies can transform the lives of people impacted by institutionalized racism. The story pointed to research indicating that BIPOC communities are less likely than white people to have access or seek out these services and receive quality care. And I invite you to read that story. I'm just going to take a moment and plug my laptop in because I see that my battery is running low. Could we all take a break and just take a deep breath for a second? That would be awesome. I'll be right back.
Think of it as a 7th inning stretch.
Oh.
To check in and see how your body's feeling. You've been at the computer since noon. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's, it's really essential just to take a breath with all this information. So I just want to continue and say that these, grassroots clinics are emerging to address these challenges that marginalized communities may face in accessing these kinds of therapies. And some examples are the Sound Mind Center in Philadelphia, and which happens to be my hometown, and the Sage Institute in Berkeley, California, which is currently providing ketamine-assisted therapeutic services that focus on serving BIPOC, LGBTQ+, neurodiverse, and disabled populations. And I think that this is a really important piece of the social impact that can be achieved with psychedelic assisted therapies. Projects such as the Sana Healing Collective in Chicago and Nautilus Sanctuary in New York have announced their intent to also enter this space into the future. For full disclosure, I want to say that I'm a member of the board of the Women's Visionary Council, which was the nonprofit fiscal sponsor for the Sage Institute, and we were proud to play that role. The Sage Institute's sister organization, the Sage Integrated Health Group, has been designated an MDMA expanded access site. And these sites will, of course, provide MDMA treatment for seriously ill patients who do not otherwise qualify for phase 3 clinical trials currently being conducted by MAPS for MDMA assisted therapy. And these access sites, I think, will offer very important services for people. The cost of this therapy is certainly a factor. Sage Institute is offering a sliding scale model and willingness to share data with similarly minded organizations. And I think this is an important thing to pay attention to. Janis Hertzberg, executive director and co-founder of SAGE Institute, has said that the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy protocol will hopefully be integrated into SAGE's upcoming certificate and psychedelic-assisted therapy training course. The Sound Mind Center says it's not participating now in that program, but according to the Sound Mind founder, Dr. Hannah McLean, the treatment could cost $20,000 and won't be covered by clinical trial finances or insurance. So better ways to help people access care through financial support, insurance, and other systems are clearly going to be needed. And, you know, as journalists, we're keeping an eye on well-capitalized clinical networks that offer psychedelic-assisted therapy, including companies like Field Trip and Mindbloom that have expressed an interest in serving marginalized communities. Some people are skeptical of venture-backed clinics expansion strategies, and you know, some believe that a slow and steady development of the therapeutic model is a better approach, and those are some things to pay attention to. And also communal and group therapy models are interesting to track to see if they lower costs and increase access to these services. But you know, whether or not inclusive clinics are ultimately sustainable will depend on several factors, from insurance reimbursements to buy-in from the communities they serve. You know, we're watching organizations that develop successful, innovative models for delivering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies and then scaling them and noting how great the need is and strategies for scaling these services. I think to take a big step back for a second, it's also important to note that the years of research showing the effectiveness of psychedelic-assisted therapies for mental health conditions has shifted the larger public perspective about psychedelic substances. It's helped support and encourage public support for legislative initiatives such as the Oregon ballot measures 109 and 110, and now SB 519, the bill now moving through the California legislature to decriminalize some psychedelic substances. Earlier this month, the American Civil Liberties Union and the Drug Policy Alliance released a poll showing that 82% of respondents believe the war on drugs has failed. That's huge. The poll also found that 66% of respondents support removing criminal penalties for drugs and replacing them with health-centered approaches. That's a remarkable shift. And I think that the focus on psychedelic-assisted therapies has played a large role in that. And I think that we should keep that in mind as we see the field move forward. Some of the stories about psychedelic-assisted therapies that Lucid News reporters have covered also illustrate some important themes about access to service and the extensive need for therapy of different kinds. We posted a story by Colleen Newvine on June 10th about CIS expanding their training program in psychedelic-assisted therapies to a Boston location. And thank you, Janis, for contributing to that story. In that story, Colleen cited information that CIS has trained about 200 people to administer these treatments, as MAPS has trained another 500 people. But, you know, as MAPS advances towards FDA approval for MDMA-assisted psychotherapies for the treatment of PTSD and other clinical trials move forward as well, there's a great need for trained providers to provide this care and not nearly enough trained therapists at the moment. And so it's just amazing to sit back and think for a second about that. Colleen reported that MAPS estimates the need for more than 30,000 trained therapists by 2026 to make MDMA-assisted psychotherapy widely available. That's a lot of therapists. And so wonder how that's going to happen, and closely watching efforts to provide that kind of training. Rick Doblin has said that 30,000 therapists equates to 15,000 two-person teams, which is the protocol currently being considered by the FDA. I think MAP said recently that they now have 300 people in their training program. And Rick said in an earlier session that MAPS plans to train enough therapists to treat 1 million people with PTSD in the first 10 years when that therapy is approved by the FDA. He also noted that Sasha led the way in terms of self-experimentation for therapists and clinicians. And so I think it's important to remember that. Colleen also wrote in her story that if each patient receives 3 day-long MDMA sessions and the 12 required non-drug preparation and integration sessions, each of the therapist teams could see about 20 to 30 patients a year, or a total of about 450,000 patients. So it's interesting to reflect on how this will scale to serve the large number of people who might benefit from these therapies. That goal may be ambitious, but as Colleen noted in her story, it doesn't come close to treating all those who might suffer from PTSD, which some estimates say affects 7.7 million adults annually, or 3.5% of the US population. That could well be a greater number, since the pandemic.
Excuse me, Annie, we have 2 more minutes.
Great. So I just want to say that, as journalists, we're covering both the emerging regulated markets for psychedelic assisted therapies and the unregulated market, which provides different kinds of care by a wide range of healers, licensed and unlicensed, traditional, indigenous, and shamanic providers. And it's going to be a really interesting series of developments to write about and to follow. And I have more to say about training programs and about companies that are putting together their own training programs in this space. But perhaps that's for another discussion. It's wonderful to be able to think about these psychedelic assisted therapies as they come to availability for wider groups of people. And I welcome any questions people have about this and the coverage that we're doing in this space.
Thank you, Annie. That was a full coverage. Really appreciate you moving from the meta to the micro, systemically, from the individual to cultural issues. Really appreciate that. Would like to invite the audience, our participants here in our rather large living room. Now that you've heard the last 2 presenters, Kile and Annie, please go ahead and put up any other words that describe what you've learned or what's puzzled you or what has inspired you. We have a bunch of questions from you, which we will try to get to at least a couple of them, and invite you to Ozo's platform so that there may be other people there who could help you with those questions that we don't get to. I'd like to pose a question that the panelists and I came up with just to get us going here, to get the conversation started. And it relates in large part to many of the questions that did come up already. And for the 4 of you, here it is. What do you think are the most potent bridges and the most problematic disconnects regarding access to care with psychedelic assisted therapy? A couple of you commented on this, but not all of you. What associated bridges and disconnects are there for supporting both individual healing and collective transformation? AKA, can one happen without the other? So panelists, which side of those questions about access to care or cultural collective transformation versus collective and or collective transformation and individual healing. Any of you go for it.
I'll jump in real quick. Annie, I appreciate so much, many things. There's many more to say about your presentation. But one of the things I'd like to highlight for just the general public too is that there doesn't have to be as big of a disconnect between psychotherapy and mental health support and peer support and greater well-being. Like, we can make bridges with those things. And oftentimes, and I used to work for the VA healthcare system, we started recently to incorporate peer support as a way for ongoing support and connection. And that was very much valued by the veterans. But there's so much potential if we can talk with each other more and really respect each other's role to play.
Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that comment. I think, you know, both the peer support and the psychedelic assisted therapeutic community have some things to learn from one another. And I'm really happy to see a lot of dialogue going back and forth with people volunteering as peer support folks and information going the opposite way as well. I think that's powerful.
Just building on that, I mean, my shtick is undergraduate education at university, and to educate in such a way that the folks coming up through the educational system become increasingly empowered and well-informed around creatively thinking about how to solve this, including peer education. One of the benefits of the previous big era of explosive psychedelic use in the 60s was that there was a lot of what's called informed user subculture, that folks really understood the effects of the materials and they could educate and support one another around that. It's great to be in a position of trying to encourage folks to become well-informed enough that they can begin to create these communities again in newly innovative ways, because it's like really different this time around. And folks are really jazzed around kind of bringing this forward in a way that's way more attentive to things like access and diversity and so forth.
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to the psychedelic societies around the world. I know that my hometown, San Francisco Psychedelic Society, is one of the sponsors of this event, and also the UK Psychedelic Society based in London. It's really good to see those communities come forward and offer education and community opportunities for integration as well.
They've been profoundly impactful for people, particularly in rural areas who didn't have any way to meet one another. So shout out to all the work that's been done in that arena. Bill, would you like to weigh in on this before we move to the first questions from our esteemed gathering here?
Only to stress, you know, the importance of patience and good education and educating the masses. And there's very few people who read our articles in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, you know, but there are people who watch programs like this and watch well-made films like, actually there's some coming out on Netflix very soon and so on. That I think the culture is getting educated, and it's not just about drugs, it's about psychological health, spiritual development, all the meditative procedures, yoga, etc., that are kind of coming into the mainstream of our culture. They're not just a fringe that people with long hair and beads in Golden Gate Park are interested in, but it's mainstream. One of the wonderful things of doing the work with cancer patients is just none of these people look like hippies. You know, they're real ordinary people who are going deeply within their minds and in a grounded, prepared way and discovering, experiencing significant personal and you could say spiritual development. And it's beautiful to see. And if we can patiently implement that in the culture as a whole, kind of one person at a time, with respectful dialogue with the FDA and everyone else, let's see what can happen. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, folks. We've got just a couple minutes left, and Peter has reminded people about going into the Ozo room. So before that happens, we have a very interesting question that summarizes some other questions that I've received. And this comes from our friend, Bob Jesse. Thank you, Bob. This is for the entire panel. To what extent can trusted friends help friends with assisting them during a psychedelic session in what amounts to insight and healing, although it's a peer-to-peer work without the benefit of a trained therapist? When is a therapist necessary or strongly advised? Good question about peer-to-peer support, and when is a therapist necessary or strongly advised?
Yeah, I would suggest, Bob and all of us, that what matters most is what I use the word interpersonal grounding, like grounding in the electric circuit, that you're with someone who doesn't have an agenda for you, isn't trying to manipulate you in any way, but is genuinely present. If you need them, if you don't need them, they stay out of the way. But they're there, you're grounded. And that can happen in good therapy. It can also happen in good human relationships, period, you know? But there are a lot of people that think being a good counselor means giving good advice or something like that. And that's not the case. So there is a place for training and being oriented to really be helpful to another person.
Wise advice. Certainly, you know, when doing peer support, there has to be an element of trust, and ideally with a peer support person and awareness, if the person that they're working with requires additional care, whether that's medical care in the moment or the care of a specialized therapist to address specific issues. Perhaps it's a potential for both peer support people to work together with therapists who are trained to work with them, and that people could benefit from both in some cases.
Agreed.
And you might want to mention to them, Annie, the wonderful manual that you and the team you worked with and you helped convene created. I don't know where it exists right now online. Can people find that?
Oh, MAPS republished it, the Manual of Psychedelic Support. It's a manual for helping to training people or assisting people to set up psychedelic support systems at festivals and events. It was reissued by MAPS, and it's up on their website. You can buy it there. And it was a collective effort from a group of people throughout the world. And shout out to an international group of peer support and risk reduction people. It was a joy to be part of.
Oh, thank you for all that hard work.
That's an excellent book. I'll just say and plug that again. Really like that. And also Fireside Chat is a new resource that's available, and it's by peer support, but they have a lot of their volunteers are therapists. So know too, when you get into sticky situations, that you can call Fireside Chat for free. Like there are resources that aren't going to the police.
Absolutely. I'm an advisor to the project, and I think it's a great project. You should donate money to that project right now. It's a nonprofit, and it has a really great group of volunteers who are providing really great support for people calling in on their hotline. Their training is first rate, and I think it is, well on their way to scaling to provide a service that we have wanted for years and years, and now it's here, and it's really exciting to see.
Yeah.
Fireside, check it out.
We so need another hour to be able to discuss the very astute and interesting questions and comments that people have asked in the chat. Everything from what really is spiritual bypassing to can you combine DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, with psychedelics, to what about ketamine for palliative care patients and their families, to what about difficult boundaries, how to work with the shadow. We've had very astute questions in here. And what I did in trying to play with all the frisbees up in the air on the field here is to suggest people go to Ozo rooms and take their questions with them, stay curious, keep asking questions. And these 4 experts speaking to you from their wisdom, take in whatever inspired you. There've been a lot of links being put up into the chat to help you follow up with your own research and your own study. And thank you for being part of the field. And I want to give a shout out to Ann and Sasha for bringing us all together. Ann and Sasha Shulgin, thank you. And in a Buddhist tradition, we dedicate the merit of a service that's been done. I would like to dedicate the bounty and the wisdom and the insights that got invoked in each of you who are participating with us. I'd like to dedicate the merit of all of this to Ann and Sasha Shulgin.